You have a familiar face here, Michael.
Hello, Tom.
Hello, hello, how are you?
No, very good. I'm just quickly going to introduce you. So, live. Yeah. So, Tom Avermaete is a full professor of architecture at Delft University of Technology in the Netherlands. He has a special research interest in the public realm and the architecture of the city in the Western and non-Western contexts. With the chair of methods and analysis, he focuses on the changing roles, approaches, and tools of the architect. His research examines precedents, design attitudes, methods, and instruments with the explicit ambition to construct a critical base of design knowledge and to influence contemporary architecture, thinking, and practice. Avermaete is the author of Another Modern, the post-war architecture of urbanism of Cadilis, Josek Woods, The Balcony, and Casablanca Chandigarh Reports on Modernity. He is a co-editor of Architectural Positions, Colonial Modern, Structuralism Reloaded, Making a New World, Architecture of the Welfare State, and Casablanca Chandigarh Reports on Modernization. So with that, we can begin. Yeah.
Excellent. Excellent. Do you want me to start? Do you want me to start immediately?
Yes, you can.
Yeah. Well, first of all, of course, thank you for inviting me. I've a bit of an echo. I must say, but I think that's okay. I of course looked at the three questions that were asked to me. And these questions, of course, were: why does the Biennale exist? What does the Biennale do? And for whom does the Biennale exist? And well, what I would like to do is to reflect a bit upon these questions. And I would like to start with the first two questions, let's say. The question of why does the Biennale exist and what does the Biennale do? For me, I would like to start with saying that the Biennale is a bit of a strange beast, if you want to. A strange beast that belongs to a series of occurrences like world fairs, like world exhibitions, but also like world festivals. All, in my mind, 19th century Eurocentric inventions, let's say. And also all moments of spectacle that were used to promote a city, a region, or a country, let's say. But what all of these world fairs, world exhibitions, and world festivals, what they originally shared, let's say, when they were invented in the 19th century, is they tried to make a sort of cross-section of the state of the art in a particular field. And they were trying to present that, let's say, present that to the world. That's for me where the Biennale started, let's say, as one of these particular occurrences that wanted to make this cross-section and wanted to present the state of the art to the world. I think that still many biennales nowadays are functioning in that sense. If we look at some art biennales, for instance, I think that there are still art biennales that have this ambition, this 19th century ambition. But when we talk about the Biennale of Venice, and when we talk about the Biennale in the realm of architecture, then I think that some of that original idea of the spectacle and this gathering the knowledge of the world in a center in Europe, let's say, is still there, but it has also changed, let's say. And what I'm going to do is try to talk a bit about that change. As somebody who has been involved in a Biennale several times, the most, let's say, intensive time was when I was co-curator of Remcola's when we were making the big pavilion on the elements of architecture. So I'm talking a bit from that perspective, let's say, from these experiences, and also, of course, from somebody who has been visiting, well, I think the last 10 biennales. architectural biennales, that is. I wanted to structure my thoughts according to three metaphors, let's say, three metaphors that come from the realm of optics. So I'm going to talk to you about the mirror, the diaphragm, and the lens. So the mirror, the diaphragm, and the lens as three ways of thinking what Biennale nowadays is doing. So not the 19th century Biennale, but the Biennale nowadays. And the first metaphor is the metaphor of the mirror, because I think that more than the 19th century Biennale, which was indeed presenting the knowledge of a particular region, of a particular country in a particular locus. I think that the Biennale right now very often functions as a mirror to two countries, two regions, to those who are responsible for, let's say, curating a particular pavilion or a particular exhibition. So this idea, what we see that in many countries, or for many countries who are present at the Biennale, what is going to be presented at the Biennale is in some kind of way the subject of very, very intense debates. And in that sense, I think that the Biennale is holding up, I would say, a sort of mirror to architectural cultures. To think about, okay, what are we as an architectural culture? What do we represent as an architectural culture? Where do we stand for? In some kind of way, you could say that the Biennale is a sort of reflexive moment, I would call it as well, with people like Ulrich Beck. It's keeping up the mirror to particular architectural cultures. And I think if we look at the contemporary Biennale, the Biennale that is on right now, where you are right now, that if we look, for instance, at the Israeli pavilion, and it's a discussion of the status quo, that's typically such a pavilion which is really, let's say, clearly the outcome of a mirror kept up to the country itself. And I'm thinking the same thing of the Estonian pavilion, which is talking about a weak monument and trying to understand how such a new nation state as Estonia can be represented. So that's the Biennale really playing its function as a mirror. So that would be the first line of thought that I would like to give to you. The second metaphor, optical metaphor, is the metaphor of the diaphragm, because I think that many pavilions, many exhibitions in the Biennale, they're also about, let's say, the sort of apparata to the intellectual and the intellectual apparata to frame architecture. I think this is a very, very important role of a contemporary Biennale. We are living in a world or in a condition where a lot of information on architecture is coming to us through media platforms, let's say, very quick, a sort of rainfall of images. And I think that several that contemporary biennales, they play a role in other ways of addressing architecture. So not through this rainfall of images, not through this digital realm, but through in different ways, let's say. And that's what I would like to, let's say, coin with this metaphor of the diaphragm, a sort of apparatus which helps us to focus on architecture, to frame architecture in a different way. And when I'm looking at the contemporary Biennale, I'm thinking, for instance, about a pavilion like the Dutch pavilion, where there is a bed where you can go and sit in the bed and talk about architecture, or small rooms where you can have intimate talks and intimate discussions about architecture. But I'm also thinking of the Japanese pavilion, for instance, where a more ethnographic way of addressing architecture is tested through drawings. Or I'm even thinking about your Turkish pavilion, where you are right now, where the question of getting knowledge about architecture is not about the rainfall of images, but is about collective knowledge production, exchange and dialogue, let's say. I think that that's a very important role that the Biennale plays as well. The Biennale as a way to test new diaphragms, new ways of framing architecture, I would say. That's for me a very important role that contemporary biennales can play as well. And then I'm going to my third line of thought, my third metaphor, and that's the metaphor of the lens. Let's say it's again an optical metaphor, the metaphor of the lens. And I think that that's what I've seen in many biennales, many recent biennales. That biennales, they also offer an opportunity to really, let's say, place the focus and the accent on a very, very particular aspect of architecture. in other words, they have the capacity to agendize a certain theme or a certain perspective, let's say. And when I'm thinking of such pavilions on the Contemporary Biennale, I'm, for instance, thinking about the French pavilion, who's talking about the cooperative within the realm of architecture. How do we co-design? How do we co-create? How do we co-build? And it's really placing the focus or agendizing this very, very particular perspective of our architectural culture. A very important perspective, but a perspective that now needs to be agendized, let's say. Or I'm thinking the same of the pavilion of the UK, for instance, of the British pavilion, where they're really talking about architectural culture as something that is, let's say, reaching beyond national borders and problematizing that with focusing on, let's say, this theme of the island, let's say, the island and its isolation that emerges from that. So three, let's say, metaphors: the mirror, as indeed keeping up a mirror to those who are curating the architectural pavilion and the architectural culture that is present in the pavilion. The diaphragm as indeed the way of framing architecture in another way than through let's say, the rainfall of images that we're experiencing every day, and indeed the lens as the possibility of agendizing a very, very particular aspect of architectural culture, let's say. So this would be, let's say, three reactions to the first two questions that you've been asking. The question of, indeed, why does the Biennale exist, or still exist, I would say, in my words, and what does the Biennale do, or what is it able to do? That's what I try to answer with my three metaphors. But I also want to say, as a conclusion then, or as a last remark, I would like to say something about your third question. For whom does the Biennale exist, let's say? I think that's most probably the most critical question that you're asking. For whom is indeed this big festival, for whom does that exist? When we go back to the history of the Biennale and of indeed also the world fairs and the world exhibitions, one can say that they had the attempt of bringing the whole world in a particular place and showing it to the broader public. But in the 19th century and also in the beginning of the 20th century, Biennales, just like world fairs, they became something rather exclusive, let's say. I think if you look at the history of the Biennale after 1968, the Venice Biennale, that there was a very, very big, let's say, attempt to make the Biennale something for a bigger public, for a wider audience, let's say. But I also think that we could question if this really succeeded as it were. And personally, I think that there is a challenge there. There is a challenge to think about the public or the publics in multiple that the Biennale is addressing. And my belief is that paradoxically, the Biennale's pedigree or its long history of being Eurocentric and being a sort of spectacle event might also be helpful in addressing, let's say, new publics, as it were. I think that the Biennale's history as a spectacle might help it to address, let's say, publics that are not only professional publics, as we too often see right now. I think that the Biennale is visited by professional publics, but I think its spectacle character might also open up to different publics, publics that are maybe less considered as the professionals in between brackets and more as the layman, but nevertheless do know a lot about architecture as well. So I think its spectacle character could be helpful in that sense and could be even played in a more radical way. And secondly, I also think paradoxically that the Biennale's Eurocentric history might also help it to start discussing about what the Biennale should be and what sort of architectural knowledge it should contain. I think its location in Europe, in a city like Venice, let's say, might be a very, very good point of departure to start asking questions about the relation between the architectural knowledge that comes from the global north and that comes from the global south, from the architectural knowledge that is produced in the so-called peripheries and in the so-called centers. So it's the fact that it's precisely located in Europe right now in this very particular city might offer, let's say, a fantastic springboard to start, let's say, asking what sort of knowledge are we producing and which sort of publics are we trying to reach. So paradoxically, the Biennale's pedigree as a Eurocentric and spectacular occurrence, let's say, might now also help it, I think, to propel it forward. That would be at least one of the suggestions that I would like to make. So these were my answers to the questions that you've been asking.
Okay, thank you so much. Professor Tom Avermaete was here with us. So, of course, you have so many questions maybe in your mind. So, if you like to join the conversations, just open your microphones and start talking.
Yeah. I have a question.
Yeah, please.
Hi, Tom. I know that you have a lot of interest in the commons, and that's essentially where a lot of your research falls. And I actually am quite interested in what do you think of the notion of free space, which is this year's theme of the Biennale, and some of the research that you, or some of the ideas that you've been positioning in terms of the commons. And in a way, what is the relation and what is the overlap of those two kind of ways of thinking? Because, and the reason I'm kind of asking this question is, after having looked at several of the Biennale conversations going on, I found that a lot of people have struggled with this idea of what free space is in the first place.
Yes. Well, and I can understand, because for me, let's say, the term of free space, it's on the one hand, I think, a very, very compelling theme. It's compelling in the sense of that it's suggesting, in the middle of this Biennale, which is still often perceived as a sort of rather exclusive occurrence, let's say, that it's suggesting that there would be a space which is shared by experts and so-called non-experts, by so-called experts and so-called non-experts, that is a space which is also a space of dialogue, of exchange, let's say. For me, the reason why I'm at the moment so interested in the commons, or in the theme of the commons, which indeed, as you are suggesting, is rather related to the question of free space as well, is that I think that these themes, they both free space and the commons, they run a risk of remaining very, very theoretical themes, let's say. Themes that are in some kind of way nicely discussed in debates like this debate, let's say. We can develop a lot of, let's say, theory about these themes. But my big challenge, and I think the challenge for us as people concerned with architecture and with the city, is to try to start thinking about how these notions of free space and of the commons, how they can become part of the way that we produce the city, let's say, of the way that we produce architecture. So I'm becoming, in that sense, I'm making personally right now, in the last years, a very, very big effort to start thinking how such notions as free space, as the commons, they can be looked upon as notions that are political notions, social notions, let's say. But in the end, what do they mean for the built environment that we are creating, that we are designing, that we are creating, that we are living, that we are maintaining, let's say? I think that that's, for me, the very big challenge that we are facing. And I also hope that with this notion of free space, that we would be able to say, okay, free space, what could that mean if we really look at what Henri Lefebvre called la production de l'espace, the production of space? What does free space then what does it really mean, let's say? For Lefebvre, it was very clear, of course, because he coupled this idea of la production de l'espace to his idea of the right to the city, of course. And for me, that's also what free space should be about, that suddenly free space should mean that actors that have been previously maybe a bit discarded from the process of the production of the city, that they now become part of this production of the city as well, that they feel that the city is, let's say, also their space, and that their voices and their opinions can be heard within the production of the city as well. So for me, that's also, let's say, the interest in the commons. And then again, when I'm saying that their voices should be heard and their opinions should be heard, I think that they, in my mind, free space and the commons, if I'm connecting these two, it's also about literally the production of the city. It's about giving actors a voice in the production of the built environment, as it were. So for me, this Biennale and the theme of free space is an invitation to indeed think more openly about how we produce the architecture of the city, I would say, and that also includes involving actors that were previously not included, as it were.
Hi, Tom. I have a question.
Yes.
Before that, this was my first time in Venice and also in the Biennale, and I was really amazed how there were no kind of limits of the structures, and each of them represents different ideas. Represents different ideas, but it was like, as you were saying, in maybe like 50 years old. But right now, I'm thinking about the sustainability of the Biennale, and it's really it has a really congested profile, and it doesn't sell at all. And I was trying to thinking in a cityscape, as if for example, in Ginza, it's also create this kind of a Biennale. It's also kind of create this Biennale of like Zaha or OMA, Kengokuma, that you can see all those different ideas at the same places. So what do you think about this, like the future and also the sustainability of the Biennale, since the Venice Biennale is going a bit like down in a way because of the not a lot of people are visiting every year?
Well, I think the question of the sustainability of the Biennale is a very interesting question. I have two responses to that. The first response is, of course, that I think that the Biennale, in its 19th century form, because it's not 50 years, but it's let's say a 19th century occurrence, the Biennale as a figure, I think can't live on. I mean, these times are over, that we believe that there should be a spectacle in which we represent all, that it would be possible to let's say bring all of the knowledge of the world together in a single place in Europe. I think that is long past. But I do think that with my three metaphors of the mirror, of the diaphragm, and of the lens, I think that they all point to possible roles that the Biennale could play in the future as well. Because we do have the necessity in a very, very volatile culture as we are living at this moment. We do have the necessity for longer moments like a Biennale, where people gather, be it physically, be it through digital means, as we are doing right now. But they think for a longer time about what architectural culture represents. So that was my first figure of the mirror. I mean, it's really keeping up a mirror. We stand still for a moment and we think, okay, what do we represent as a national architectural culture, as a regional architectural culture, as architectural culture at large? I think in that sense, the Biennale could play a very, very important role in the contemporary condition that we are living. A second response that I wanted to give, which has to do with the sustainability of a Biennale as well, is that the Biennale is very, very often, does remain too often, I think, for me, a very volatile event. We are generating interesting thoughts, for instance, in this very moment, but these thoughts, they, let's say, evaporate, as it were. When the Biennale will be over, the thoughts will be evaporated, and the next Biennale, the chance is rather large, that we start all over again. So I would be very, very interested in future projects for the Biennale, where in some kind of way, the recording of what has been achieved in this mirroring, in these reflexive moments, would be in some kind of way stored, so that they form a sort of platform, let's say, for further thinking. I think that would be a very interesting element. What we see right now is that many of the pavilions, they make a catalog prior to the opening of the Biennale, but I think that there's a very big role for, let's say, in some kind of way, the archive of the Biennale in the long run, archiving these intense moments, these moments of standstill in architectural culture, these reflexive moments in architectural culture. Because if we really think about our contemporary architectural culture, I have the feeling that we lack moments where we really can stand still and in some kind of way digest and redigest what architectural culture stands for. And I think that the Biennale could play such a role. A moment of standstill, a moment of reflection, a mirroring moment in relation to my first metaphor.
So actually, like you're right, the idea of the Biennale is maybe in the late 1800s, but the structures are mostly built in we were like wandering around today. It's 1960s and 1960s, 1970s most generally. And if I have to add that, like, since the nation state is a bit like right now controversial and always in question. I was also trying to figure out how would you see the possibility of the future of Biennale through the national state, actually, because like in 200 years before, they were trying to make it more stronger, the idea of nationality, but right now, I mean, I think the dynamics are changing.
If I may respond to that, I think what is rather interesting is that, as you are rightly saying, of course, the concept of the nation state is a concept, well, which is on the one hand weakening, and on the other hand strengthening. Of course, if you look to Britain in its contemporary condition, we see a nation state which is becoming very, very almost like an empire again, you could say. And I think that this let's say this move of at the same time weakening and strengthening is also something interesting in architectural culture. I don't believe, of course, that the Biennale should be something which is all about strengthening the idea of a national architecture. This is long past, but in some kind of way, these old-fashioned concepts as the nation, they still sort of work, and they still are active and operative, let's say, as starting points for a discussion about what architectural culture is, and for instance, a starting point for how globalized architectural culture is. At the previous Biennale, for instance, I'm myself a Belgian citizen. At the previous Biennale, there was in the Belgian pavilion an attempt to start exploring, okay, in what way could Belgian architecture, but it also included some British architects and some Dutch architects. How do we see a sort of, let's say, an alternative idea or approach of architecture emerging, let's say, within the large globalized world that we are living in? So my suggestion would be, of course, these national pavilions, they feel a bit like relics of the past, but my suggestion would be that they also offer very, very interesting points of departure to start a discussion about what architectural culture is, how architectural culture can be delineated, how the global and the so-called local, they relate to one another. I don't hear you right now. Now I hear you.
Hi. Following up on Michael's question,
Could you compare the response of the national pavilions to the response of the creators themselves to the theme of free space?
Do you mean the national pavilions as they are articulated right now?
Yes, yeah. Like the main exhibition to the responses of the national pavilions, although they don't really have to respond to the theme itself. And not real national.
Yeah, it's a good question, but also a very difficult question that you're asking me, because I think that in some of the national pavilions, let's say the question of free space was, I mean, let's say that the theme of free space is such a wide thematic, let's say, that I feel that indeed very few pavilions have been responding to this question of free space in for me a sort of consistent way. Maybe this brings me back to the second metaphor that I was trying to suggest to you, this metaphor of the diaphragm, because the diaphragm is for me something of it's for me really about the question, how do we frame architecture? And I think what we see, and that's something rather interesting when we look at the architectural media and even the architectural criticism nowadays. I find that we see a framing of architecture. So, I mean, the way that architecture is analyzed and it is criticized, which is rather uniform, I would say. So when I'm looking at the architectural media, I mean, we have, of course, first of all, a big set of architectural media who is not framing architecture any longer, but which is just presenting architecture. It's just offering us a set of images, but there's of course, luckily also still a set of architectural media which is trying to frame architecture. But I think that what I would say is a positive thing of the content of the Biennale as it stands right now, is that I feel that there is a certain kind of surge in different of the national pavilions, but also in the general exhibition of, let's say, the multiplicity of framing architecture. And I think that's good, because I have the feeling that when we look at architectural websites, at architectural journals, that very often our framing of architecture has become very, very sort of univocal, limited. We're all doing that in the, let's say, from the same sort of vantage points. And I find that every now and then in the Biennale, I found pavilions, but also in the general pavilion, I found that there were, let's say, unexpected moments of addressing architecture. So, I mean, I liked a lot, for instance, the Japanese pavilions with this idea of a sort of ethnography. I mean, how can we start to draw architecture in some kind of way, getting us out of the dominant regime which we see on all of the Arch Daily and all of the websites, and trying to expand that visual regime again. I think that that's really something that the Biennale can do as well. So in that sense, I do think that the Biennale as a whole, because of its, let's say, poly-perspectival character, is indeed creating a free space again. It's freeing us, let's say, from the dominant regimes of representation and of understanding architecture, I would say. And that was my second metaphor of the diaphragm, let's say. I mean, I have the feeling that we're confronted with many diaphragms, as it were, many ways of framing architecture.
So, Tom, we really thank you for your very insightful speech, and I think this threefold metaphor would help us better understand the whole structure of the biennial and the architectural world in general. Unfortunately, Arsenal is shutting down and they're kicking us out, so we have to conclude our broadcast.
Well, I would like to thank you. I would like to thank you, of course, for inviting me. And I would also wish you a good continuation.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.